Hello everyone. So we are going to learn query key value vectors in this video. Okay, we're gonna need these things if we're going to study self-attention mechanism. So let's just begin. Let's say we have a sequence of words. Okay, so cat sat on mat, and our AI needs to understand how much attention it is going to give to each word here. Okay, so let's say cat is more important than the word on. Okay, and sat is also important, mat is also important, you know. So when we give an AI a sentence, the AI needs to, kind of mathematically figure out, which values, which vectors, and which words are important and stuff like that. So, to understand that more, we're gonna learn query key value. Okay. So here, each word is represented as a vector. We already know a vector is a list of numbers, right? So think of it as many dimensional, or just think of it like there are three dimensions there, and vectors. I think you have already learned vectors, so I'm not really gonna explain everything in depth, but here just understand this, that for each word there are vectors. Okay, so cat has a vector. Let's just call it x1. For sat we have a vector. Let's call it x2. For on, x3. For mat, x4. Okay, so just vectors that coordinates that capture meaning. Okay, so um, here, well, you might be asking, why a vector instead of just a number? So we could have just said, cat. Let's just give a number to cat. So let's say it's 150. Let's say sat is just 110, and things like that. Well, a single number can only capture one thing. Okay. um, let's say a single number would just say how positive is the word, how good or how bad the word is, stuff like that. A single number cannot represent too many stuff at once. Okay, so but a word actually carries many things at once. We already know that, right? A word like cat, it has a meaning, it has a grammatical role, it is a noun, right? you know it has relationship to other words, like cat sat on mat. So cat is related to other words here in this sentence. So a vector is going to you know um, make us understand all of it, uh, by having multiple numbers. So a vector is just multiple numbers packed together. Each number will capture different aspects of that word. Okay, so x1, as we have already said, x1 is the vector for cat. So it might just look like this, 0.2, 0.9, and dot dot dot. Let's say there are 512 numbers in this list, or this vector, and each position here, in that vector, encodes some aspect of cat. Okay, so in physics, when we talked about vectors, we were mainly interested in about the spatial axis and stuff like that. I mean, where an object is located. Okay, so we were interested in that kind of stuff, but here these vectors are, you know, encoding some aspects of a word. Okay, so this is not about, you know, where in x-axis, y-axis, you know, the object is located and stuff like that. Okay, so you don't hand design what each position actually means. The model actually learns what to encode there through training. Okay, so when you give a sentence or a sequence of words, the model would just learn through training how these vectors should look like, you know, how much attention it should give to each word, and so on. Okay, so obviously vectors are a richer representation than a single number. So I hope you have understood the reason behind using a vector instead of a number. Okay, so the next question you might be asking, you know, when processing the word, any word, okay, let's say for this example, for this case, sat. Okay, when processing the word sat, how much should each word influence it? So there are three other words there, right? So cat, mat, on, these are three other words. So how are these words influencing sat, right? We need to know that, and we really need to understand that mathematically. um, I'll get to that later. Okay, so cat, matters a lot, right? So who is sitting or who was sitting, you know so obviously for the word sat, the word cat really matters a lot. For the word sat, mat also matters, because where was the cat sitting. But for on, well, it's just a grammatical thing. It's structural, it's a preposition. It's not that meaningful. Okay, so we need a system where for each word we need to compute how much does every other word matter to me right now. Okay, so for that computation task we use query key value. Okay, so as we have already talked about vectors like x1 for cat, x2 for sat, and so on, we will see more vectors here. Okay, so this is another vector, query. Okay, so query vector. So what is it about? Well, query vector is about this: what am I looking for? Okay, so um, this is basically the question that current word is asking. Okay, so for our example, for sat, it is saying, well, I'm a verb, I want to find out who did this action, who sat, and where it happened. Okay, so we already know the cat sat on it, and where it happened, well, on mat, we know that. Okay, but we need to encode this mathematically. Okay, so um, later I will explain how that works mathematically, and I'll explain the formula in another video, but for this video just let's understand the intuition. Okay, so we have this vector which is key. So key is about this: what do I offer to match against? So this is what each word advertises about itself. Okay, so let me give an example. Cat is basically saying, well, I'm a noun, possibly a subject. Okay, so the key of cat is, stating this. The key of the key of mat is saying, well, I am a noun, possibly a location, right? We already know it's a location. uh, Key of on is saying, well, it's a preposition, it is grammatical, it's structural. Okay, so um, let's just recap a little bit. Query is about asking questions. Okay, so for any word, for sat, let's say, it is going to ask, who did the action, where it happened. Okay, stuff like that. It will ask questions, and key will tell uh, you know what the word is advertising about itself. Okay, and value is going to say this: what do I actually contribute if I get selected, um, or this, this is the actual content a word passes forward. Okay, so let's say for cat, it is furry, it has 4 legs, it has 2 eyes, all these things. Okay, all these features are or attributes, you know these should be in this value vector. Okay, so um, this value would say something like, since you have identified me as the subject, take these attributes like being furry, having 2 eyes, take these attributes and add them to your understanding of the action. Okay, so the value of mat vector would say, well, I am a flat woven rectangular surface, right? So let's just recap again. uh, for any word, let's say for sat, um, we wanted to find out who did the action, where it happened, and this was the work of the query vector. And then for cat, mat, on, we looked for the keys um, of these words, key values, key vectors, and we found out these were nouns or prepositions, and based on them, you know we uh, got to the values of each word, value vectors. Okay, so all of this. And then well, you might already be asking, why do so much work? We a little bit earlier we have talked about these x1, x2, x3, x4. We said that x1 is the vector for cat, x2 is the vector for sat. But now we are saying for cat only, we have a query vector, a key vector, a value vector. So we have 3 different vectors for one word. Okay, so for 4 words we're gonna have 12 vectors. So that's so many, right? So why actually do that? Why not just use x1, x2, x3, x4? So we will have one vector for one word. That should be easier. Well, we have a reason. So if we just compare x1 to x2, we're gonna do so much work. Okay, so if we just compare them directly to figure out how much they matter to each other, the problem would be like this. uh, X is doing too many jobs at once. It is the word's meaning, it is the words, it is what the word is looking for, it is the content it wants to contribute. So, you know, we were already talking about, what this word is looking for. That part belonged to the query vector, right? And then um, the meaning of the word, that belonged to the key vector, and the content went in the value vector. But now x1 contains all of them. Okay, so asking one vector to do all three things at once is gonna, make a mess. Okay, so the signal might get confused. I'm not explaining how the signal actually gets confused mathematically and stuff like that. That will take a different video. So just take it as a fact. Okay, so that's why just, uh, instead of doing so many things with one vector, we take three different vectors to divide the tasks. Okay, so, so now how query key value vectors are produced. Okay, so let's say you have your input vector for SAT. So we already knew that, we called it x2. Okay, and x2 had 512 numbers. Just let's say, it had this many numbers in the list, and then we multiply um, this x2 with three separate weight matrices. Okay, so we get q2. So q2 is basically the query vector for the word sat. So what would be q1? Well, q1 would be the query vector for the word cat. Okay, it is as simple as that. So q3 is query vector for on. For the word mat, q4 would be the query vector. Okay, so here, we get the query vector by multiplying multiplying the weight q and x2. Okay, and then we get k2, which is the key vector for sat, and then we get v2 by multiplying like this. Okay, so here you need to understand this weight these weights like wq, wk, these are, each of them um, is a matrix of learnable numbers. Okay, so if you have already done an AI course where you have probably learned neural networks, you have seen weights. Okay, so there the weights were just some numbers, but here these are matrices. Okay, so these are just, initialized randomly, and then they get adjusted through training. Basically they improve after each iteration. Okay, so the result is, well, this, we get three different vectors, q2, k2, v2, each with different job. So I have already explained, q2 is going to be about asking questions, k2 is about, what the word is advertising, and v2 is about all the attributes, features, content. Okay, so these three are doing three different jobs, so all derived from the same x2, so all derived from one vector. Okay, So um, now this happens for all the words, right? So cat sat on mat. We have 4 words here, which means there are 12, vectors. So here you see, you know, Q1, K1, and V1. These 3 are for cat, and then Q2, K2, V2. These 3 are for sat, and then all these are for on, and these are for mat. Okay, so this is how we get all these values. Uh, and remember, these Q1, K1, V1, all these are vectors. Okay, these are not normal numbers. Okay, and same 3 matrices, WQ, WK, WV, are applied to every word. Okay, so I think, or I'm hoping, that you have gotten the intuition here a little bit. So I have just explained what query key value vectors basically are. In later videos, I will explain how they work mathematically, how the formula works, and later I'll explain how the overall self attention mechanism works. Okay, but for now, you know just understand that, well, we have these 3 vectors for each word in a sentence or in a sequence of words, and these vectors are just going to represent different things about the words. Okay, and they are basically calculated from um, their vectors like x2, x1, and stuff like that. Okay, and then using these weight vectors, matrices. Okay, so vectors that explain something about a word. Okay, so I hope you have understood at least this much. Later I'll explain more. Okay, goodbye for now.